Hello. Good afternoon. Welcome to this DIIS seminar on rebels and the state in Central Africa. From South Sudan to Chad and from the Central African Republic to DR Congo, rebel groups seem an endemic feature of Central Africa's political landscape. With rebels here to stay, we need to make sense of their role in the making and unmaking of political order in the region. Are rebels best understood as genuine resistance movements rooted in popular dissatisfaction, or rather as profit-driven warlords that cut deals with governments? Are they proxies for governments or guardians of local autonomy? In this webinar, leading experts not only offer you an inside look into rebellion in Central Africa, but also explore different ways of thinking through the intricacies of state-rebel relations in Central Africa. Today, we'll be able to hear from an exciting set of invited speakers. They are, in the order of appearance, Louise Lombar, who is calling in from Oslo. She's an associate professor of anthropology at Yale, who has developed an expertise on African borderlands, where the state is largely absent. She's the author of State of Rebellion and most recently Hunting Game, which is just out. Two amazing books giving us unique perspectives on some of the world's most remote hinterlands. Then from Ghent, we have Kun Flashrod, director of the Conflict Research Group and professor at the University of Ghent. Kun has spent decades collaborating with Congolese and foreign researchers to capture the ever-elusive horizon of conflict and order in Congo. From Geneva, we are joined by Joshua Crace, an independent writer invited for his expertise on South Sudan, but whose CV is just as mind-boggling as the conflict dynamics in the world's youngest nation. With a PhD from Berkeley, Josh has, amongst others, taught anthropology in St. Quentin Prison in California, written essays on paintings and forgetting, done groundbreaking research in South Sudan for the Small Arms Survey, and is in the process of completing a novel. And oh yeah, he just published an op-ed in The Guardian today. Kun will unfortunately have to leave before the discussion, so we'll be joined by Casper Hofman, an assistant professor at the Department of Food and Resource Economics at the University of Copenhagen, and an expert on rebel governance in Congo, who has published widely on theories of order and power that can help us make sense of what goes on there. I'll be your moderator for today. I'm a researcher here at DIIS with a love for roadblocks. I have mapped 800 of them in Congo, 300 in the Central African Republic, and I'm currently mapping all the checkpoints in South Sudan. My book on the first two countries, Roadblock Politics, will come out with Cambridge in just a couple of months. Before we start, I would like to have a look together with you at what we are talking about when we talk about rebellion in Central Africa. I have prepared a PowerPoint, which I hope I'm able to show you now, with just a few images of the landscape of armed groups in the region. This first map is of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And while it might be difficult to capture exactly what you're seeing, this colored, it almost looks like an abstract painting, depicts the over 140 armed groups that are today present in the east of that country. They range from self-defense groups, small and large, to armed groups, and this mind-boggling diversity of rebel groups will be the subject of what Kun will discuss with us today. Here we have a map of rebel groups in the Central African Republic, showing that de facto 80% of the country's territory has some form of armed group presence. In fact, if you look at the map that we produced together with the International Peace Information Service, if you cross out all the armed group zones of influence, the only portion that remains, which doesn't have a presence of armed groups, is this little small corner in the southwest. And then for South Sudan, it was more difficult to find a map of armed groups. Only this here map I was able to find, where you see also a widespread presence of different kinds of armed groups. But Joshua Crace will surely be able to help us think through these dynamics. Now, there are just as many theories of rebel governance as there are rebel groups in the region. One frame of mind or approach which has recently gotten traction is, for instance, Alex de Waal's theory of the political marketplace, in which he proposes that we need to understand rebels just as political actors affiliated to the state as cynical deal makers who exchange cash and violent power for influence. Another theory which is prominent is the rebel governance idea. The idea that rebel groups exercise state-like governance. They are perhaps not alternatives to the state, but we should understand them as state-like. Of course, there's a long tradition of looking at rebels through the lens of resistance studies and resistant movements, taking them at face value, rebels, to fundamentally revolve around the resistance of the extension of state-led projects of power projection. Which of these theories make sense in which kind of context? Are there other kind of theoretical tools we need to make sense of the relations and entanglements and, of course, oppositions between states and rebel groups and their kind of enduring presence in Central Africa? So I would like to not listen to myself for the seminar, but instead to the invited guests we have for you here today. So without further ado, if you're ready, Louisa, could you talk us through what you, in your fascinating research, have learned about rebels and the state in Central Africa, the Central African Republic?
Thank you so much, Pierre. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I'm really excited for this conversation. So given that part of our focus today is a comparative focus, where we're trying to look at these different cases in their relation to each other and see what we learn, I thought that it might be helpful for me to start my presentation today with a kind of overview of some of what I see as the big dynamics in rebellion in Central African Republic. And then I wanted to follow that by diving a bit into the history of this region, stepping away from the contemporary scene of rebellion and looking into some of the interactional repertoires of governance in the remoter parts of the Central African Republic. So, it used to be that I had to explain when I was talking about Central African Republic that I had to explain that this is not the Congo, it's its own country. But thanks to the war in the Central African Republic over the last 5 or 10 years, I no longer need to do that kind of scene setting. The country has become a bit more famous or infamous, perhaps. Now, violence has a long history as a tool for governing in this region, and so do rebellion and different modes of popular protest. But really, from the mid-1990s and onward, we've seen an intensification of some of those kinds of dynamics. And in particular, since about 2005, so about the last 15 years, we've seen the rise of rebel groups in CAR. And in the early cases, these rebel groups emerged out of local protest movements, and then received some tutoring from sideline politicians and different international actors in how to present themselves as credible rebels to international observers and different media representatives. So, step one was to come up with the patriotic name and its attendant acronym. Step two was to assign somebody to be the spokesperson and issue press releases. And step three, maybe to make nearly everyone in the group an officer. And on one level, it worked. This rise of rebel groups was correlated with a rise in humanitarian aid to the Central African Republic and a generally sort of higher profile for the country internationally. However, it was also very unstable. The rebel group members' grievances only grew, as did their, honestly, in many ways, justifiable sense of exclusion. And there were always ousted or sidelined politicians who were ready to team up with some of these dispossessed youth in the hinterlands and demand regime change, or at least make a credible threat to doing so. And in so doing, then get taken seriously and receive new sinecures. Now, in 2013, a coalition of these rebel groups, including some important, maybe even decisive participation from men in arms from elsewhere in the region, succeeded in taking power in the capital. Now, their time in power was experienced by many Central Africans as rapacious and brutal. And so many people rose up to protest that kind of treatment. And violence on a very wide scale followed. And eventually an African Union peacekeeping mission, and then a pretty massive United Nations integrated peacekeeping mission. Since 2015, the levels of violence have more or less diminished, although there continue to be flare-ups. Incidents here and there are more or less constant. And there are also, as Pierre pointed out with this map, there continue to be more than a dozen rebel groups that effectively control most of the country's territory. So yes, there's been a peace agreement between the government and these rebel groups almost 2 years ago at this point. But while the parties and signatories to this peace agreement spend lots and lots of time, long meetings, discussing what kind of sanctions should be in place, should there be any violation of the terms of this peace agreement. Meanwhile, even according to the United Nations, there are somewhere between 50 and 70 violations of the peace agreement on a daily basis. So what's going on here? In a word, extroversion. Now, normally I try to nurture my allergic reaction to jargon, but in this case, this term extroversion from Jean-François Bayart is lamentably apt to describe what's going on. Already in the 1990s, when Bayart coined this term, he pointed out that some African leaders had learned to speak the language, the discourse of democracy, but without engaging in any of the substance. And this worked well from the perspective of getting support from donors. But as he too pointed out, this sort of extroversion through democracy had limits. And as he writes, he says, this mode was unable to incorporate either economically or institutionally, in terms of either education or ideology, young people and rural communities, in spite of the fact that these two excluded categories actually compose the majority of the population. Too often, it is war which has instead become the vector of their mobilization. War, yes, but I would add rebellion, because you can have rebellion and you can have rebel groups that persist and that are around and are in control for a long period without having outright war. Pardon me 1 second while I get a sip. So what we have now in the Central African Republic is a curious cooperation between the rebels and the president. Now, I don't mean that they're actively cooperating, although there are some rebel groups that have signed different alliance agreements with the president, showing support for him in the run-up to the presidential elections at the end of this year. What I mean is that, pardon me, what I mean is that donors and a lot of Central Africans too have a vision for the Central African Republic that, what they hope to see maybe 5 years from now is a situation in which there's this strong kind of Weberian type state that provides security and different kinds of social services. But from the perspective of some of these government elites and rebel group leaders, that imagined future is really just a kind of fantasy that enables what is actually going on. And that sort of what is actually going on seems likely to persist, namely having a president that controls the capital and that has a special relationship with donors, while you have all of these rebel groups that are controlling much of the country's territory, particularly in terms of taxation and different modes of extraction. So, and who are the losers in all of this? Well, of course, this is the majority of Central Africans, the vast majority of Central Africans who are not members of any rebel group and who are just trying to lead prosperous and flourishing lives in the midst of an incredibly challenging situation. So, yes, it's a little bit depressing. But I think that if you come in and try to take a more hopeful, perhaps a more hopeful view of things, a more optimistic view of how things are going, then the risk is that you're not really taking seriously that 80% of Central Africans who live on well under $2 a day, the more than 1 million Central Africans who are displaced either internally or outside of the country, a figure that has held steady since about 2017. All right, now in the minutes that are left to me, I want to turn a little bit away from this contemporary overview, situating ourselves in the scene in Central Africa, and look back a little bit in time in history, because one of the things that I'm really fascinated by are the different kinds of interactional repertoires that develop around politics. And for me, I've been very curious to understand this on the ground in the northeastern part of the Central African Republic, which is very, very remote, very sparsely populated kind of an area. Now, I published a book on this topic, as Pierre mentioned, earlier this year, and it came out just as everyone was sort of hit like a wham with lockdown. And now that lockdown has become a bit more normal for all of us, for better or worse, hopefully now maybe people will have the headspace to engage with this book called Hunting Game: Raiding Politics in the Central African Republic. At least I'm ready to start, talking about it a bit more than I did when it first came out. Now, in this book, I'm doing a version of what my co-panelist today, Kasper Hoffman, and his co-author Judith Verwejen argued for in a study of rebel rule in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, they argued that understanding rebel rule requires understanding the kind of mentalities of the governance at play, which might be quite different from those associated with a classic political science model type of state. Now, similarly, in northeastern Central African Republic, there's been very little in the way of state building, but there have been other repertoires, other mentalities, other practices of politics at play. And so in the book, I look at the last 150 years or so, and in doing so, one of the things that's really striking is that there has been a lot of a kind of violent hunting in this area, of projects of what I call forceful acquisition, taking things with force, or in a word, raiding. So the book tracks the evolution of raiding skills and different kinds of raiding encounters from the period of the trans-Saharan slave trade, which was really ramping up in this region in particular at the very end of the 19th century, into colonial forced labor regimes, to big game hunting and coercive conservation, and into this contemporary phenomenon of rebellion. And one of the things that I found and that I was trying to really probe and take seriously, was that raiding is a mode of forceful acquisition that flourishes when people's status in relation to each other is unclear. And people who are pursuing different kinds of raiding projects, they develop improvised skills along the way, things that I refer to as camouflage, practices of displaying force vis-a-vis the other people in the area, and denouncing. And they do so not because they're trying to build a state or something state-like and manage populations in a stable way. No, they do it more in order to make claims to different kinds of privileges to extraction, and different forms of liberty, of being free from others' unwanted and excessive regulation. So again, I think many political models, whether they really recognize it or reckon with it or not, they tend to assume that production, and management are key governing tasks. And Northeastern CAR, looking at this long history, is a reminder of the fundamental role that taking, including by force, has in power relations. And one of the things that I noticed is that rating has been particularly important in encounters between people who are unfamiliar with each other and potentially dangerous to each other. And that it happens in places where infrastructure and institutions, law, for instance, offer little guidance for social interaction. And so instead, people have to situationally manage the conflicts of values that arise as they encounter each other in these projects of forceful acquisition. And ethical relations are marked much more than by negotiation and confrontation than they are by a kind of quest for deontological consistency. Now, there's a whole book length of things that I could say about rating. So please give me the chance to do that by asking about it during the discussion. But for now, I wanted to tie together the two parts of my presentation today, the overview of what's going on in Central African Republic, and then this invitation to think through rating as an interactional repertoire of politics. Because I'm actually making a somewhat similar point across these two components of the presentation. And that is that when we're talking about rating, rating is not a rebel thing. It's not a government thing. It's something that everyone who wants to rise up and kind of make a name for himself, and indeed this is a pretty gendered phenomenon in this region, has been participating in, even people who see themselves as quite different from each other. That's one of the things that really stood out to me in this study, was the ways that colonial officials would get drawn into rating and participating in rating, even though they saw themselves as very different from that. And they saw themselves as very different from, for instance, these trans-Saharan sultans. And so there was a kind of repertoire of politics that everyone was participating in, regardless of how they sort of saw themselves or described themselves. And so in the first part of my presentation, I was talking about how there's this weird way that the government and these rebel groups are kind of participating in very similar kinds of projects and maintaining this situation, this honestly quite lamentable situation that the country has been in for a long time. And similarly, in my historical work, I wanted to say, well, you know, what if we didn't take for granted the ways that people would describe themselves as being different from each other, as being part of different categories of actor, and instead thought about what they're actually doing. And when you do that, you see a lot more similarities. And so this leaves me with a question, or maybe a provocation of a kind, which is, you know, in what ways is it useful to maintain the category rebel and its opposites, state or whatever else it might be? And in what ways do taking those categories for granted and using those in our analysis, in what ways do they perhaps prevent us from seeing similarities in terms of actual practice, in terms of participation in different kinds of interactional repertoires? So thank you for listening. I look forward to talking more during the discussion and the question and answer. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Louisa, for that thought-provoking presentation. So in order to save time, let's save the discussion, and let me give the word to you, Kun.
Thank you, Per. It's a great honor to be part of this amazing panel. And I have to confess, this is my first true webinar, so forgive me if things go wrong. Well, I think many of the things that Louisa just has presented will also find their way in my presentation, so there's a lot of connection here. What I will do here today is not to provide you an empirical reading of state-rebel relations in the Congo, but draw from that case to share a number of more general observations and thoughts about how to study the specific state-rebel relations, but also how to understand the persistence, the sort of consolidated presence of armed groups in a context like the DRC, particularly in the East. I want to share with you first a number of general observations before moving on to armed groups. First of all, a very obvious starting point is, of course, that the state in the DRC is but one of the many actors today claiming part of the public order, contesting for power and for the monopoly over the use of violence. Even more, it has gradually lost its capacity as the main regulating actor. As Per has shown in the introduction, today we are witnessing over 100 armed groups operating in the East only. Of course, not all of these armed groups have equal shapes, have equal capacities, have equal objectives. Some are very well structured military, can be considered as small armies. Some have increasingly invested in governance capacities. Still others are very small scale groups guided mainly by the search for resources. But also, these armed groups are not the only ones claiming for public authority, but are in direct competition at different levels of society with a multitude of non-state claimants to power and providers of public goods. It's a very complex context with many players being part of the larger dynamics. What it does also help us to do is to point at a highly fragmented political order, a highly fragmented security and political landscape. Now, second introductory point is, in order to fully understand the politics of armed mobilization and complexities of current conditions, we need to take a larger historical perspective. And I'm not the first one here in this panel arguing for this historical perspective. Rather than changing the nature of politics or aiming for a reverse of existing logics of rule, of extraction, of violence today has become a key strategy, not to change things, but to confirm existing structures, existing mechanisms, practices of governance, predation and control, which have been in place for a long time, long before the proliferation of armed groups. In other words, I think we should not consider the Congo Wars as a turning point. In some senses it is, but not when we talk about larger structures, because these Congo Wars and their aftermath have largely confirmed, yet increasingly also have militarized existing logics of order making. And that brings me to the third preliminary thought, which is about international interventions. International interventions of state and peace building do not have produced such a turning point either, or have not been able to promote this kind of turning point they all have been aiming for. State building strategies aimed at building what has been called this Weberian liberal state. These strategies have not been able to reverse these dynamics, but rather, even more worrisome, have had the opposite effect. Interventions trying to reform the security sector, to demobilize and reintegrate combatants, to promote stabilization, all have provided new incentives and spoils to armed groups and political military elites alike. So the guiding ideology that restoring state authority would reduce the impact of the armed groups and bring back stability has largely failed and is a complete misreading of the current situation, because it made existing actors and logics even more resilient to change than ever before. So where does that bring us today in our discussion about armed groups? Well, there is a growing tendency to understand civil war complexities through a reading of conflict in terms of opposing power networks. Now, the advantage of such a reading is that it allows for an understanding of how different actors connecting armed groups, to customary leaders, to businessmen, to army commanders, to political elites. All these actors are forging alliances in a sort of a mutual effort to position themselves in the current political military landscape. Political struggle in this perspective then is considered as sort of a competition between different power networks who fight for sovereignty over territory, over people, over resources. Now, these networks constantly reposition themselves and in some cases aim to be co-opted by the network at the political center itself, which seem in some cases to be more advantageous than stay as an autonomous network. This is an interesting and a quite popular reading of civil war today, but such readings show how state-armed group relations are to be considered as being part of larger strategies and how violence itself is a strategy to secure these relationships and for armed groups to get access to specific networks and get linked to power brokers and political elites. And I think that is a very important message that comes out of this kind of reading. In the case of Congo, I think such readings reveal how armed groups today are part and parcel of these different power networks. In a system where the state can be considered as sort of a, as they say in Congo, sort of a parapluie, sort of a larger structure, structuring also the conduct of these networks and facilitating connections between the top of the network and places of extraction, guarantee that the spoils move upwards the political or the political military chains. Armed groups in these kind of structures play a considerable role as competitors and allies, as access points to popular bases and resources, and as crucial parts of these networks of extraction. And in return, such power networks allow armed groups indeed to consolidate their control over territory and resources. Besides the democratization of militarized politics, it is also leading to a militarization of society at large. Now, this reading, how helpful it is, does not fully explain, to my understanding, the persistence of armed groups in Eastern Congo, nor do they tell us completely why we are witnessing such a constant process of fragmentation, which indeed is co-produced by changing strategies, strategic conditions, and the constant need to reposition, as is also witnessed in cases like Libya and Syria, just to name but a few. I think in order to sophisticate our analysis and our reading, there's probably three additional elements I would like to add to the debate here today. Three additional elements which help us to unravel the strategic and persistent positioning of armed groups in Eastern Congo society, but also helping us to define the state-society relationship in that particular area. The first point is that over the years, and we're talking now about more than 20 years, armed groups have become dominant participants in order-making processes. Armed groups are strongly embedded in local society. They respond to collective needs and obligations. They share and reproduce social practices which give meaning to society and are dominant forces in politics, resource control, and social relations. As I have argued with some of my colleagues like Kasper Hoffman and Judith, armed groups are both agents and objects of social transformation. They are at the center of it. Social transformation caused by violent conflict. Armed groups are guided by the same social structures they are coming from, they stem from, they originate from, and are still connected with. And at the same time, they reshape these social ties. They reshape the social fabric they have been produced by. So in doing so, they have claimed dominance. They have taken central stage in the provision of protection, of resource governance, of the provision of justice, leaving civilians in many cases no other options than to engage with these armed groups, and in doing so reproducing the power position armed groups are claiming in local societies. So that is the first point. A second element I wanted to add to the discussion here is that armed groups have deployed and developed or reproduced a number of governance techniques. Indeed, as Casper and Judith have shown in their article, in consolidating this dominance in local society, these techniques have been very crucial to it. And one of this is their reference to stateness. In their quest for power, in their quest for control, social control, for public authority, armed groups constantly refer to a sort of a language of statehood, and they mobilize symbols and practices of statehood and stateness. They use state discourse not only to strengthen their embeddedness in local society, but also to give meaning to their efforts to control society, to give meaning to their governance capacity, to express this governance capacity and the ability to accumulate all sorts of different resources, and in return provide a number of public services. So this language of stateness seems to be very crucial in this. That brings me to the last point, and something which is often neglected, which is the individual positioning of combatants, those actually being a part of armed groups. I just finalized a paper with a number of Congolese colleagues about the constant mobility of individual combatants. And we came to the conclusion that armed groups produce alternative social spaces to those joining them. By doing so, they often mobilize social practices of home society, so in a way reproduce society. And the presence of armed groups, as much as it can be considered a moment of social rupture, is also sort of an experiment in constituting new social spaces, a new way of life, a new form of social and symbolic capital, and eventually for the individual combatant also producing a new identity. So combatants' consequent capacity to navigate between different spaces, between home and the armed group, largely also defines their response to political and security challenges, to mobilization and demobilization campaigns, and to their own individual challenges and ambitions. So joining armed groups is much a way of making sense of changing realities as a response to security threats or mobilization efforts. This explains, I think, why we today have to acknowledge that armed groups are not only security actors, they provide an alternative social space while simultaneously imposing and offering new ways of life, protection, forms of belonging and identity to their members. And it is this mobility of combatants, this constant coming in and going out, which has become a key part of the militarized and transformed society in the East. It explains also why demobilized combatants often decide to return to their armed comrades or respond to opportunities provided by newly created groups, and to navigate between their position and role of armed actor and civilian. Being combatant is sort of a bridge between different social spaces. It's a bridge between society and their armed representatives. In many cases, they call themselves the community army, l'armée communautaire, just expressing how much they remain embedded. And so being combatant provides this opportunity to use both roles simultaneously, a protector of community and a member of it at the same time, being part of it, but also joining different social spaces. And this navigation between these different spaces has become a persistent condition of life of many combatants and ex-combatants. And I think this is one of the key elements also which explain the persistence of armed groups, but which often go unnoticed in political economy kind of readings. So just to conclude, Per, bring all together here, armed groups are strongly connected to larger politics through their capacity to access power networks. And in any case, their access to power networks is conditioning their specific position and their specific dominance. But at the same time, we should acknowledge that armed groups are strongly socially embedded and reproducing and transforming social structures and practices they stem from. I think these two elements are key to when we want to answer why Congo continues to be characterized by such a high military fragmentation, but also a militarized political landscape and a militarized social space at large. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kun, for this amazing set of reflections. I believe that you have to leave to take part in a PhD defense. So thank you so much for your participation. I'm sure that we'll have this will inform a great discussion afterwards that Casper will try to take over for you.
Well, I'll watch the video then.
So thanks so much and have a good weekend. Thanks. So just before I forget, to everybody in the audience, there's a Q&A function here that you can use to ask a question to the panelists as a collection, or to any of the specific presenters based on their presentations. Please be so kind as to introduce yourself as you formulate your question, and we'll try to take them up during the Q&A after the presentations. So now we've been to the Central African Republic, we've visited Eastern Congo. Time to travel onwards to South Sudan. Joshua, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peer. I should say, like most rebels, I claim to be an independent analyst, but I should give due thanks to my real sponsors, because all independent analysts, like all rebels, are actually in the pay of someone, which is to say I'm currently a fellow at the LSE, and I'm a writer in residence at the Embassy of Foreign Artists here in Geneva. So I wanted to talk about 4 categories. One is the category of soldier. The other is the category of militia. The other is the category of rebel. And finally, the category of bandit. And I wanted to say what actually makes, why do we use these different terms, and what use do these different terms have in South Sudan today, and then draw it back to some of the broader issues that you've all talked about. So let's begin with the term soldier. What you have in South Sudan is a political economy that since the late 70s is largely predicated on a militarized elite that does 2 types of things. The first thing it does is it intervenes into the people on the ground, and it does that through raiding, through looting, and through that process restructures what populations look like. It does that because it's dependent on exterior processes that it instrumentalizes. So guns from Addis during the Second Civil War, food aid from America, food aid from Norway. So there are these external processes which are restructured relative to operations of pillage on the ground. Within that process, there's nothing particularly that separates out rebels from government. Like, that's the same generic process being done by commanders all across the country. What distinguishes that, just to bring up something we can maybe return to in question and answer, from Alex Duval's framework, which is the political marketplace, that said, look, basically there are a series of commanders on the ground who are available to the highest bidder. There's no ideology. Everyone is basically in this sort of entirely monetarized political system. I think what distinguishes what I've just laid out about South Sudan's political economy is that what's effectively happening is a massive wealth transfer from people on the ground to the elite. And that elite then instrumentalize those people who have been displaced, who have lost the possibility of farming, by instrumentalizing them as members of militias or the army. So I think that's the sort of a general pattern, is this intense wealth transfer, the immiseration and displacement of the population, and the creation of an elite military class, which couples among its members both rebels and government members, and often government members who are rebels and rebels who are government members. And we're going to go into some of those wonderful dialectics shortly. At the same time as there's that political economy, there is something called the state. And the state is very important. The state gets legitimacy from the international community in the region. The state has access to various forms of external support that rebel actors, for instance, on the ground may not have. So, for instance, oil incomes, various forms of aid rents from renting out buildings in Juba, the country's capital. Now, of course, the state is in control of what we could say is the legal sphere doesn't mean that the state does legal things. The state is in possessor of what Deleuze, the French philosopher, would call a structure of illegalisms. So I'll give you an example of that from the COVID period, which is in northern Bahr Ghazal, which borders Sudan. There, both the Sudanese government and South Sudanese government decided that they would no longer allow certain types of trade. They're going to allow trade in everyday foodstuffs, but not in concrete and not in timber. Does that mean those things cease to be traded across the border? Obviously not. They will continue to be traded across the border, but now the soldiers who man the checkpoints at the border could charge double the money. And indeed, all the migratory labor forces that were going north on the season of migration to north to Sudan were even more imperiled. So there was an intensification of illegal activity, but that intensification of illegal activity was both produced by the government and intensified government control. So that's an example. We don't want to think of the state merely as a sort of like dictating merely the boundary of the legal, and then everything outside of that is non-state. Rather, in determining the boundaries of the legal, the state gets to instrumentalize what is legal and what is illegal on the basis of the political economy that I set out above, based on predation, largely relative to the country. So we see that double logic during the civil war that begins in South Sudan in December 2013. So you have an army, the government army, which at the beginning of the war, let's not forget, is split into two, with the vast majority of the army actually going onto the side of the rebels, who we'll come on to in a second. And then we have the government. But for the last, so from 2011 at least until 2013, the government had slowly been withdrawing support from the army, because the army was multi-ethnic, because the army was in hock to a series of commanders it couldn't afford after the crash in oil prices, and it started invested money in militias, mainly under Paul Malong, but these militias pluralized throughout the war. The logic of this move was as follows. The army can do certain things, but the army is the visible expression of the government. The militia is not. So what the left hand of the sovereign does, effectively, the right hand doesn't have to know about. So classically, during the campaigns that the government did into Southern Unity, an area in the northeast of South Sudan in 2014 and 2015, it wasn't really soldiers, it was militias. And so when the militias looted all the cows, killed many, many young men, tried to actively destroy an entire way of life, the government said, I don't know anything about it. Now, we should also specify there that many of those young men who are militias are also soldiers in the National Army. So we're not talking about some ontological divide between them. We're talking about sort of an ontic distinction of visibility, which is to say that when the army gets to be rebels, in this case, militia members, then it is outside of certain frameworks of, for instance, the rule of law, outside of certain frameworks of responsibility. And that provides a constant challenge, for instance, to international lawyers or to Human Rights Watch or to the UN when they're trying to think about what is command and control. These are crucial terms about being able to track from the top to the bottom a chain of responsibility that would allow one to make, for instance, a legal determination of, for instance, ethnic cleansing. None of that is in place in South Sudan because of the way that the militia works. Militias are effectively given the possibility of having semi-autonomous control in a region. And they use that as part of that political economy of extraction and predation to carve out their own space. I think then the other important thing that differs a militia from a soldier in these purely sort of ideal types of what they're supposed to do in their legal roles in this conflict is that in theory, soldiers go against the rebels. And the rebels are, in a sense, the mirror image or the inversion of the soldier, because they're contained within a bilateral peace agreement framework in which the end goal of the war is that everyone comes back together in one army. And that's so, in theory, soldiers should be fighting other soldiers. That's not the case with militias. What militias do is they act directly on the socius. So in Unity State, rather than attacking the IO, the SPLAO, the Central Rebel Force, which had entirely fled, it attacked villages, it destroyed ways of life, it displaced and immiserated a population that produced a population which was then instrumentalized by the government. Indeed, it was recruited back into militia forces by the government because that was the only way to provide for people's families. The other thing that militias can do, which I think is very interesting, is that they can intervene to create the conditions that justify the intervention of the army. So in Upper Nile, for instance, what you had was there was a Shilluk militia, the Agwalek, which was unified with the government. And this didn't suit any of the government in Upper Nile's interests, who were Padang Dinka, who wanted to kick the Shilluk off their land. So what they did, rather than just brazenly sort of attack the Shilluk, which wouldn't have gone down well in the rest of the country, was they used militia forces to assassinate Olon, who was the chief and still is the chief of the Shilluk Agwalek's deputy, and then they tried to assassinate Olon, pushing them out of government. So then there was a phase in which the Shilluk suddenly became the rebels, and then of course the thanks to the actions of the militia, and then the government go, okay, so now we do need to bring in the army, unfortunately, and then they bring in the helicopter gunships, and there is effectively a sort of a de jure achievement of what was de facto achieved, which is the split between the Shilluk on the one hand and the Padang Dinka on the other, who are both the militias and the army. But you see that the Padang Dinka functioning as a militia are able to do different things to the Padang Dinka functioning as an army. So there we have one distinction, which is that there is a government and the government has militias. So how does this relate to, I guess, the most famous figure we might have, which is the Sobel from Sierra Leone, right? Which is the soldier by day, the rebel by night, which is to say someone who is in the national army, but in the evening, participates in illegal activity, goes raiding, kills people, steals things, and so on. Well, I think the difference there is in that binary, the rebel is the marker of illegitimacy, of that which is outside of the legal framework. And I think what's particular about the question in the war in South Sudan this time around, this civil war, is that from the very beginning, the rebel is put in the framework of a future peace agreement in which the rebel will rejoin the government. So if the rebel there doesn't become the antagonistic figure who is somehow outside of the law, the rebel becomes a figure who is always trying to show that they can get back into the government. So, for instance, one of the first things that develop is just as there is soldiers with a militia, there's also rebels who also use a militia. And those militias, to come back to some of what Kun was talking about, were militias that are antagonistic to the very logic of the army. So in the case of the SPLA-IO, the main rebel group in South Sudan, we have a rebel group which is structured in divisions, in hierarchies, which imagines itself on the basis of the South Sudanese army, the SPLA, which in turn imagines itself on the basis of the Sudanese army. So we're going back through these various military hierarchies. Whereas the variety of the militias attached to the main rebel movement, say the Dechimbor, the Gojam today, are communitarian self-defense militias, to return to what some of Louisa was saying, whose initial actions at least are to defend their territory, and then latterly to strike out on raids, pastoralist raids, for cows from local groups. They are consistently in this uneasy tension with the main rebel group, who instrumentalize them. They take part in raids, just as they're instrumentalized by the rebel group. So there's a process of mutual instrumentalization. For the Gojam, it's very useful to receive weapons, such weapons as the IO have, from the main rebel group. For the main rebel group, it was very useful during the campaign on Malakal, which was a city, one could almost say, in Upper Nile, to have rebels for the same reasons that it's useful for the government to have rebels. Because when the White Army went in, the Dechimbor went in and sacked the entire city, killing many hundreds of Dinka, the response from Mashar and from the main rebel group was, those kids are crazy. We have no control over them. We have no idea what they're doing. So we have that same process, which I think is crucial to understanding the logic of rebellion in an era of the International Criminal Court, in an era of supposed peace agreements that determine, in theory, at least the end of a conflict, is that question of visibility. And so then what we see, one of the reasons that becomes really crucial, and I'll skip over the first peace agreement, but that's also really interesting, is in the second peace agreement, which was again this bilateral framework. Mashar, the head of the opposition, Kiir, the head of the government, when they come, they're going to be happy, they're going to sit in Juba again. And the first thing we decide in this very sort of formalist framework of internationalism is we're going to produce a unified army. Despite the fact that, in a sense, producing a unified army is what led to the war in the first place, but I digress. And the first thing we need to do to produce this army is we need to count how many rebels there are. It's very important to count them, because then we can work out how many should be in the army. And what was really interesting about this is, of course, like one, as Louisa's work has beautifully shown, as Marielle de Boer's work has beautifully shown, like there aren't per se rebels. Being a rebel is part of a life which might include simultaneously being a farmer and being a soldier and being a bandit and being a whole variety of, and working for an NGO. Like, so to count the rebels is sort of a misunderstanding of the way in which rebels are, because of course, given the possibility that one can be a rebel, many people were like, I'll be a rebel. Are you going to pay me? That sounds cool. So what happened was that the chief of staff of the IO, of the Sudan People's Liberation Army in opposition, went on a recruiting tour through his territory. And in some of those territories, he found that people were willingly wanted to be rebels because they had a memory of the CPA period, where there was this huge amount of government funding which went into paying off the soldiers. This was really the period for me of the political marketplace. In other areas, they had to use forced conscription because no one wanted to be a rebel. And in other areas, the Gojam and the Decim Board, these militia forces, said, you guys aren't even the rebels, we're the rebels. We should be the army, you guys, the actual sort of soldier rebels, we're not going to allow you into the training site. So then there were interventions by the government who wanted to make this process continue because then they're going to get some money from the peace process, had to intervene to moderate between the militia of the rebel side and the rebels themselves. This process, of course, so then is the question of like, who gets to be a rebel? To what end? And to what place in this political economy? And this plays out time and again in South Sudan, that being a rebel itself becomes a valuable category because it means one gets external support from a peace process. On the basis of military might, one gets access to resources in Juba. And this very much is the framework of the political marketplace for me, right? That is like, it's a place where the political marketplace is very useful, is understanding these sort of peace negotiations. But here's something where I don't think it's very useful for, which I come to my fourth category, which is the category of the bandit, which is the moment that the RAR-CSS was signed, the revitalized peace agreement. The government went to war. In fact, the moment the peace agreement was signed, we've seen intensification of violence in South Sudan. Now, the UN, which has withdrawn from the IDP camps that it was supporting over the last 6 months, has decided this isn't political violence. And because it's not political violence, it doesn't really count. What is political violence? Well, political violence for the UN is properly considered as violence between rebels and soldiers that constitutes a claim of a political power in Juba. Now, we've already seen at the beginning of this talk that that's not actually what the political economy of the country is about. And what the peace agreement allowed for the government was the designation of its main opponents, which in this case is NAS in Equatoria, the Shilluk militias, etc. We could go into the details, as non-political forces. And because they're non-political forces, which is to say they're bandits, they can be attacked and it doesn't violate the peace agreement. So on the one hand, in Juba, the rebels are sitting in government, and indeed the rebels, which is to say the IO, have now teamed up with the government to attack the bandits. The problem with the political marketplace framework in this situation is that the bandits have real substantive problems with the government. They cannot be bought off. They are the process of 30 years of exclusion from a political economy based on the predation and capture of minority groups. Of course, you can buy off a given commander. The government just did that in Maywood with Ochan, but you can't buy off the communities. So in a way, I almost want to say that the actual category of interest, the category that sort of suggests the limit of the way liberal internationalism via these peace agreements in South Sudan deals with violence in a place like South Sudan, is that they actually think that everyone can be bought off, and that the political agreements are basically about sort of inclusions on the basis of profit. And what they don't see is that the last 30 years in South Sudan, 40 years really, is a history of the fundamental exclusion of groups, their immiseration and their displacement, and the creation of a class of military actors, both rebel and government, because really it doesn't make a difference, who instrumentalizes those poor, immiserated people as militia members, but fundamentally doesn't resolve the problems that have created the fact that they've been pushed off their land and have no means of reproduction other than being militia members. And it doesn't resolve those problems because today in South Sudan, they're created by the very process that has created this government, which is to say that both, this is the last line, the UN, the government, and the rebels have looked at this war, which is even more violent than when it was an actual war, and they decided it serves all their frameworks, especially now they can call it peace. Thanks, that's it.
Thanks so much, Josh, for that amazing run through of South Sudan. So thanks to all of these amazing presentations, guys. We now move on to what is labeled a kind of panel discussion. So that basically is set up as the opportunity for each of you to kind of respond and comment on each other's presentations, and also, perhaps more importantly, to try and find perhaps linkages, overlaps, or theoretical frictions that can be productive in thinking through rebellion in Central Africa. Before we start to actually do that, I would like to perhaps let Casper Hofman take the first go at such kind of reflections. Casper.
Okay, thanks. I'm very honored to take the floor after these great talks. Trying to make a bridge or an overarching argument, it's a bit difficult given the nature of the presentations, but I do think a few things stand out, which I've been thinking about and noting down. And one thing is for sure that and one thing I would myself completely subscribe to as well is it's problematic to operate with a very firm dichotomy between the state and rebels, and in fact many other categories through which we try to understand these conflicts or these situations. And I think let's say the complexity and the flexibility of the strategies of the actors, both in terms of their pursuit of, shall we call them, material resources, and then also in their attempts of legitimization, sort of lends credit to the idea that this is really a sort of very complex and let's say set of strategies, and that ultimately the boundary between categories is extremely blurred to the point where the blurriness itself is actually part of the strategy. And I think this is extremely important because the way we frame these or under the frameworks through which we understand these conflicts have a sort of way of, let's say, a reifying looping effect, which means that rebels and actors on the ground can instrumentalize and think through these or use these, deploy these let's say categorizations through which academia and policy experts and governments think the conflict. So that's one reason to try to look at it in different ways. And the way I find personally useful to look at it, and I think I've heard both actually all three speakers say it in this way, is to look at what people actually do. Let's look at what they do. And when I say do, it's not some kind of let's say mechanistic physiological thing. It's what do. It's also what they're saying. Their discursive practices. So and that's essentially in the article that I have produced with Judith that both Kun and Louisa refer to, is essentially what we are trying to do and say, well, rather than try to think about rebel governance, for instance, in a certain way, by employing certain, let's say, conventional or traditional ways of thinking about politics and political order in the West, let's put it that way, which have been, of course, exported to many other parts of the world, such as the state, territory. Let's look at what people actually do and what they actually think. And I think there are all sorts of reasons to do that. And one of them is actually not to put words in their mouth and thoughts into their heads. And it's extremely difficult to do, and frankly, it requires quite a lot of research, amongst those people who are, participants in the conflicts. It's very difficult to assume from the outside that, what's going on in people's rationalities. You cannot necessarily easily translate ideas of economic incentives or transcendental economic interests to actors involved in conflicts in these places, but which is not to deny that there are financial interests and so on and so forth, but that they are always already contextualized and situated and part of a sort of much broader, wider set of strategic concerns. So those are my sort of initial comments. And what strikes me with the comparisons between the two other countries, so CAR and South Sudan, is that actually many things are similar to Congo, but there are also certain differences, of course. I think I'm not over, let's say, stretching the point by saying that the Congo is, let's say, particular in its in the vastness of its actors. Let's just put it that way, and the complicated webs of networks and the very peculiar geography of that country, and as you know better than anyone, the infrastructure of that country is sort of very particular as well, which makes it possible, from a sort of human biophysical interaction point of view to see why things develop in a certain way in the Congo. But that's not, I won't go into that, but that's really your field. But I do think that the main point I want to make is that actually all the categories that we use, like be it rebel, be it state, be it perhaps even raider, we cannot, first of all, they are not, let's say, self-evident. They are actually part of the struggle. It's like, for some, it's useful at a certain point to call themselves a rebel. It has a certain capital to it. Or at another point, for someone else, it's useful to call themselves, or associate themselves with the state. And this is something which is also runs through the literature on vigilantism, for instance, in around the world, is that it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, and that the whole idea about justice, popular justice, if you like, is to actually draw the boundary between right and wrong, or to be or to be not. It's at different moments in time it can be useful, and so that's probably the key point. There are lots of questions I see here in the chat about DRC specifically, but those are my opening remarks.
Thanks, Casper, for a nice and provocative set of comments and suggestions. So the impression I get if I listen to these different presentations and takes from Central African Republic, Congo, and South Sudan, is that one key thread, a dark one, is one of appropriation, extraction, as a kind of driving logic that underpins a set of practices which are shared beyond state rebel divisions, and we should actually perhaps foreground these set of practices or logics rather than the divisions. Now, that is obviously a difficult one for takes on political order that are handicapped by the fact that they require to think through the state. Sorry, guys, nothing to do about it. We have to work with the idea of the state, and international interveners have to work with the idea of the state. So perhaps in responding to each other, how would you help these poor people who try to get into these countries and want to help out? So Louisa, back to you. Perhaps you have a set of reflections based on the other presentations and on some of these questions.
Thanks. I would love to respond. Although, to be honest, I'm still thinking through these really rich presentations. I have to say thank you so much, Pierre, and to DIIS for organizing this, because it's been really exhilarating to have the opportunity to hear from colleagues in this kind of a way. It makes me realize and remember that we all get smarter by talking to each other and sharing ideas, as opposed to just sitting alone in our solitary apartments and in front of the computer screen. So thank you for that. I had a few sort of reflections or questions as I was listening to the presentations, elements that I wanted to throw out there. And one was, it seems to me like one aspect of this story of rebels in this Central African region that we haven't really talked about explicitly is the sort of the differences between rebels who feel like they are operating at home, sort of among their people in some way, or not at home. And I'm thinking of this at-homeness both in spatial terms, like it could be that there's a place that they see as their sort of home territory where they are operating, but you could also think about it in terms of people. So who are the people who they see as being sort of our people and they're operating among? Because especially somewhere like Central African Republic, there are very big differences between groups that see themselves as being kind of locally mobilized. They're still farming, they're still, living in their villages, and they're also doing different kinds of maybe defensive, but maybe also offensive operations in different ways. And compare that to groups where maybe they were, the members were born somewhere very far away, and now they're operating in this new area. And there's a very different sort of set of dynamics that come out of that. And I wanted to bring this in part in response to Kun's point about how embedded these armed groups are. And I think he's absolutely right, but we do have to be attentive to the ways that this sort of sense of being at home shifts. And as a result, also the sense of sort of who is with us and who is against us, or what is the social terrain in which these different groups are operating. And I think that would probably be quite important in the South Sudanese context as well. And maybe one of the things that's distinctive or particularly pronounced in South Sudan is the changes in terms of what counts as at home, and who counts as at home, my people, that kind of a thing. It seems like particularly on ethnic lines, that's changed a lot in recent years. But I put that out there as one possibility. Then I also wanted to pick up on the point that Joshua made at the end about how only certain modes of violence get recorded as political violence, and that political violence is this government or soldiers, government soldiers versus rebels. That's what counts. That's what gets recognized. That's what's visible internationally. And it's funny, actually, one of the very first papers that I wrote in graduate school was about exactly that. It was about how some of the armed actors in Central African Republic had seemed to have learned that they could qualify themselves for different kinds of international largesse, different kinds of recognition, by taking on the trappings of a rebel group. Now, in actual fact, they were the same people who were road robbers, just a few months before, or what have you. And so there was something about taking on this sort of symbolic repertoire around formal rebellion, or conventionalized rebellion, as I've called it, that just sort of immediately put them into a different category in terms of what their violence was doing, what it was called. But one of the things that it strikes me has changed since, say, when I was writing that paper, which is now almost 15 years ago, and today, is that although it's true that only sort of the same kind of violence gets described as political violence, but given that there are these new kind of residual categories that have emerged. And so nowadays people will talk about, and UN people or other kinds of interveners will talk about intercommunal violence. And intercommunal violence has become a category in a way that I think is new, or at least changed, and has become kind of rigid in somewhat interesting kinds of ways. So I'm kind of interested in that process and in what some of its consequences might be. Then another sort of question that I had, or sort of curiosity, was I was really fascinated by Joshua's presentation, talking about how sometimes the same people might be working as a soldier and a militia person, or a rebel and a militia person at the same time. And I was curious sort of what you know about how people who are occupying these different roles experience that kind of shift. Because although in some ways they're doing similar things, in other ways there are differences in the kind of ethical repertoire that is at least imagined by the position of being a soldier as compared to the position of being a militiaman. And you talked about this in terms of command and control. There's a sort of different understanding of command and control, at least in theory, for the soldier than for the militia person. And I'm just sort of curious, like, how people on a kind of experiential level, do people experience this as it's all about the same? It just has to do with how it's perceived by people elsewhere. That's the difference. Or do they see it as being a kind of, a shift in terms of their own kind of moral stances and behavior? I'm just curious about that. And then maybe Pierre, at the end, you talked about extraction and the importance of extraction as a process in all of this. And I'd like to underline that. I think that's a really important term, and it's one that has come up in all of the presentations so far. I guess one element that I might add to it would be we've talked about Duvall's idea of the political marketplace and the idea of accumulation and sort of accumulating wealth through these different kinds of armed activities. And one thing that's been useful to me in thinking through the history of this region is to add back in, or sort of in conjunction with accumulation, to think about acquisition or taking, extracting, without assuming that the person has thereby accumulated things, because these are very unstable processes, and even people who've been pretty good at extracting and acquiring, taking things with force, can find that they get overturned, or that their people are able to mount some kind of a credible opposition to them. And so I think it's important to track not just who takes what, but also the kind of whole life course of that and how it gets taken back and back and forth, at least potentially. So I think I'll stop there, but thank you to everyone. This has been really fascinating, and I look forward to discussing more.
Thanks. So Joshua, without me taking up time and space, do you want to pick up there?
Sure. There's at least 10,000 things to say about what Louisa said. I mean, so this to begin with the last point about the really important point, the difference between accumulation and extraction. I think often those two things get disappeared into the same category, and they're importantly different. So in South Sudan, for instance, there are effectively two types of cattle raiding, and they might even be bound up in the same process, but they lead to very different ends. On the one hand, you have Dechimbor, Nuer community militia forces, which go and steal cattle, which maybe enable a marriage. On the other hand, you have those very same fighters doing a raid, which is just for their boss in Juba. And so one of the things you see in a place like Mayom in the west of Unity is that there are now increasingly large herds owned by politicians in Juba, such that what appears to be ICV, or Inter-Communal Violence, and I'll come on to that in a second, is actually deeply connected to the politics of the capital. But it appears to be cattle raiding. And so there's actually a process of real accumulation going on the one hand, and there's also this process of predation and the circulation of cattle between different Nuer communities, which has its own politics, but I think is fundamentally different to this logic of accumulation. And too often, I think the international community, because it's so keen to develop this category of ICV, to not see this distinction. To come onto these categories, because I'm writing an essay, an academic essay at the moment about them, it was really interesting to me, and though this will age me too, to remember that moment in the 90s where everyone thought the enemy was Kaplan, right? And the coming anarchy. Does everyone there are some nods so we can all show our age. Good, right? And at a certain moment, that's obviously a dumb argument, right? And for those who are younger, at a certain moment, sort of Kaplan had these atomized West African populations who were going to just create total anarchy and chaos. And well, that's stupid. We're going to show that violence has a logic and a political logic, and we're going to show why these people respond in very thoughtful ways to meaningful concerns about the neoliberal state as it emerges in the 1990s, etc. Actually, it seems like Kaplan's age really is now for me, in really disquieting and interesting ways. So in South Sudan, there's been a big push to declare certain types of violence as Lisa said, non-political. And the reason for that is that one, then you don't have to distribute aid. Then in the era of austerity, you can choose where aid is distributed, of certain types of aid. Two, it means that the peace agreement is a success. So there's this sort of reinvocation of a logic of primitivism, a logic of, oh, that's what they always do, which means that there is no intervention necessary there. What there is needed to be is management. And so the relationship to that violence ceases to be a problem which has a political solution or has a political logic. It becomes a problem of crime, and into which the government must intervene as police to manage the problem. So then it's no longer, in a very Foucauldian way, a question of eliminating it. It's a question of having it at measurable levels, because as I quote from an interview I did 3 days ago, that's what they always do. So I think there's something very interesting there about the sort of story that tells about violence, and actually rebellion there is something that emerges almost as a threat to that framework. And I think one of the arguments I'd make in response to Pierre's initial provocation, which is like, what do we tell people about the state, is a really boring thing that every anthropologist will say, but I'll say it nonetheless, which is like, be very attentive as to where you look for politics. Recognize the political stakes of the things that your organizations don't necessarily see as political. Ask about those connections between Juba and the way things are occurring in the peripheries of the country. And then just the last couple of very quick points in response to what Louise said, in terms of the ethical repertoire, one of the really interesting things about militia soldiers, as I find in Greater Upper Nile, and I think it's a slightly different story elsewhere, is that it's the militia forces that have a great ethical repertoire, of course, as I think you probably knew when you asked that question, like that it's the Dechimbor of the White Army that have a certain ethical limitation to the logic of violence, and it's the army that functions as the disembedding force, as the force that actually isn't constrained, because it often, for instance, the army often doesn't live in the area where they are. And I think this comes back to some of what Casper was saying and Louisa was saying about, so we need to embed these forms of violence in the social networks and relations in which their form of life becomes meaningful. I think that's true, and I think that's really important in South Sudan, given the degree to which all the forces are what Schmidt would call telluric. They're effectively defensive in function and located towards a given ground. On the other hand, I think what's really powerful about this war and terrible is the way it's disembedded social forms. It's dislocated people, and it's produced sort of forms of what I maybe want to call the asocial social, new forms of relationality which are based in destruction. And they're not based in previous community understandings, but are emerging precisely because those understandings are no longer enforced. They no longer make sense. And for me, I think the tricky thing about studying violent forms during this current war is to try to give an account of the sort of the positivity of destruction, as it were, the way destruction, but certainly by the army, has created new social forms that can't just be explained by relation to historical antecedent or by relation to a given social pattern in some Durkheimian way. And I'll stop there because I could just go on.
Thanks. I think that actually leads on to a point that I wanted to ask all three of you. So this is about violence, about something which from far away may seem like just really irrational levels of brute violence and destruction, which you see across all countries. I mean, Casper, in Ituri, there's this rebel group that's called Codeco, which is very mysterious because nobody really knows who it is. There's no central kind of steering behind it. But over months, villages end up destroyed, people, everybody dead. Central African Republic as well, there's enough examples of really terror-like forms of violence which are being deployed. And South Sudan, of course, Joshua, you mentioned it yourself already as well. Forms of destruction which are difficult to grasp as being productive. Clearly, I wonder if you have if you've developed ideas about it. And maybe Louise, you want to start there?
So can I ask, what's the question? Is the question just talk about violence, or sort of why does violence happen at high levels?
Yeah, so is there something, is there a way that you find productive to make sense of these forms of violence as a strategy which helps rebel groups to achieve certain purposes, which from the outside might seem random violence, but actually you stumbled across something that you think is productive as a way to think through it?
So I guess the first thing that I would say is that when violence has been at really high levels in Central African Republic, it's been in moments that people are experiencing as periods of existential threat, sort of a threat to their continued ability to go on as they have been. And in particular, a kind of a feeling of existential threat, and that there is some kind of an identifiable enemy, some kind of a force or actor that can be seen as being the cause of this kind of existential threat. And I don't know, I find, Arjun Appaturai's work in his book, Fear of Small Numbers, drawing on Mary Douglas, her work, Purity and Danger, which itself drew on her field work in Congo, to be pretty helpful here for a few different reasons. One being that he's talking about how particularly intense forms of violence can get enacted against people who are seen as an existential threat, but who nevertheless are often a minority in the situations where they're where people are doing this. And he draws us back into the really sort of emotional entrainment, or confrontational entrainment, which is a term that comes from Randall Collins, who is a sociologist who studied the microsociology of violence. And just talking about how these kind of violent encounters are not like other kinds of interactions between people, because there's this sort of emotional intensity that goes into them, a kind of entrainment, which refers to how the different parties to the interaction kind of build the emotions and the sort of sense of being involved in something together. And that's very different from sort of sitting down and thinking through, what's my policy going to be here, or what's the procedure going to be for how I'm going to treat some kind of bureaucratic process that comes across my desk. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because I'm not sure that it's always, I think other cases might be very different. Even Congo and South Sudan might be very different. But in Central African Republic, these sort of higher levels of violence, they're always very, they're not just functional. They're not just sort of achieving some kind of rational goal. They're very symbolic. It's a kind of, I talk about shows of force and denunciation, this kind of making a show that, no, you can't do that to me, and the proof is that I can do it to you. Sort of deeper meanings of vengeance. And I think all of that has been important to when we've seen violence at high levels. But I think CAR might be a little bit different from the other countries in this respect, because although, I certainly don't want to minimize the extent of the violence there, it hasn't been on quite the same level that we've seen in Congo or South Sudan, in part just because, CAR has, 4 or 5 million people compared to some of these other countries like Congo that have, I admit I don't actually know how many people are in Congo, but it's a lot more than 4 or 5 million. Thanks.
Casper?
Yes, okay. Okay, interesting set of questions here. I think the destruction part in Congo is mainly going on in actual warfare, let's put it that way. And it's not necessarily that common form of violence in Congo. It's usually in sort of isolated episodes that we have actual warfare. I think, at least Judith was here because she has the numbers better, but she tried to do a study in Fizi in South Kivu about violence and violent incidents, and the vast majority of violent incidents were carried out by non-identified armed men that just burst into houses and do terrible stuff, and a lot of it is what they call in Congo compte rendu, so score settling. And so a lot of sort of violence which is not let's say political in the strict sense of the word, and in my own experience, destruction, for instance, by the RCD during their counterinsurgency operations in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was classical, trying to weed out the Mai rebels, right? And it had terrible side effects for them. In fact, it really backfired. So I haven't seen this kind of systematic destruction tendencies so much. I have to be like everyone else with the Turi question. It's really something which I don't really have a good answer for. If it's anything like previous conflicts, this kind of flare of so-called intercommunal violence, it has to do with the positioning of certain local leaders and political elites, and with a relationship with Kinshasa, and perhaps some interest in some resources, but it's pure guesswork. I really it's unfortunately it eludes our so far completely, more or less, what's going on, although we can guess, right? But No, but so yeah, I think it's when you think about violence, I really think it's you know, it's important to be very specific about violence. So not just to say violence with a broad stroke, because there are all kinds of different kinds of violence with different kinds of rationalities, you know, individual. But I will say one thing, which I think is, and it connects to this idea of the community. And I think this is, you know, the community is a, you know, a very beguiling metaphor, at the same time as it's a very, say, dangerous metaphor. Because you know, so many things can be done and have been done in the name of the community, and it's very, very clear in the Congo context. Of course, it's like it's this ethics whereby the survival of our own community depends on the destruction of the other, and it's really it really took you know, shape during the Congo wars, and it has sort of left a mark there. And it's not something which was there to the same extent before the wars. So the wars have changed something. It's not just a structural reproduction. At all, apropos the sort of, let's say, emotional intensity of physical violence, what it produces in people, you know, it should not be underestimated. And how that can be mobilized into, you know, a political resource. And at the same time as the community can appear very fixed and sort of, you know, it's also very flexible. It's in the sense that the idea of the community, in the sense that, you know, you will have, in my own research, you know, I started doing research in Congo in 2005, and you know, at that time, the big enemy of the Mai Mai, the big other, was you know, the Rwandan regime, and the sort of the racial category of the Tutsi. And you know, I come back a few years later, and the wars have sort of ended, and it's after 2009 when Rwanda has pulled out, and a lot of things happened, and all of a sudden, the big power, the big force in that area is the FDLR, and all of a sudden, you know, the big enemy is the Hutu, and I'm thinking, you know, you know, these categories are extremely flexible. And it's always a working construction for strategic purposes, and it's constant boundary work about who belongs and who does not belong, and to serve all, you know, always someone's interest, of course, and it's very, very tricky, and it needs to be, you know, understood as a claim more than anything else. And terrible things have obviously been done in the name of the community. So I tend to see it, the notion of the community, on the one hand, as a social construct, historically social construct, which has colonial precedents, of course, with the categories such as Hutu and Tutsi and so on and so forth, and the terrible history in Rwanda, but also a political resource, which can be mobilized at, you know, and at the same time be flexible. Yeah.
Great, Joshua.
I think there's been three processes going on in the last 10 years in South Sudan, and they have to be read together. One of them is increasingly instrumentalized violence, and I think there are all sorts of experiential logics of violence that aren't counted within the logic of instrumentalized violence. But what I mean by instrumentalized violence is a Bull Nuer militia going south, displacing an entire population and taking over the land, burning all the crops, taking the cows. That sort of raid has become increasingly frequent over the last 2 years. And that's had a couple of consequences. And some of those consequences are intentional and some of them aren't. But I think you have to read them together. One is that extant community agreements have become increasingly less valid. People place far less trust in them. And so there's been increasingly the desire for mono-ethnically organized, created, as Casper rightly points out, areas. So everyone wants their own GPAA, which is the area given in theory to the Malay. Then the Padang Dinka want their own area. And so there's been this disaggregation of communities because of that breakdown of violence. But because of that, correspondingly, actually what the violence has produced is an increase in law. No one trusts any sort of like tacit sort of agreements within the social framework. Everyone wants it written down with a boundary. This is where my territory is. And that's sort of not against what's like the use of instrumentalized violence. I think it's produced partly by it. And then the third process, the productivity of violence, is that it's massively increased the marketization of South Sudan. Because communities that were engaged in various forms of, the right word isn't subsistence farming, right? It's rather, it's material production, which is not reliant upon market exchange. in a variety of different forms. A lot of those forms have been destroyed. It's not clear for newer pastoralists in the south of Unity that they will actually be able to go back to pastoralism. In many ways, they've continued the ethical frameworks of pastoralism while in IDP camps in Bentiu. But in terms of the actual practice of having cows on that land, it's really not clear, because two things have happened. One, they've become very dependent on the market and they've been in the camp for 10 years. Two, that land is now owned by commanders. So what we've seen, like, marketization is not just about people's increasing dependence on markets for food. South Sudan's become a net importer of food, but it's also about the fact that what was this massive wealth transfer during the Second Civil War has now been formalized legally. So there's now the de jure ratification of what was achieved through violence, which is the wholesale displacement of people from land. So if you go to a place like Wau in Western Bahr el Ghazal, you see that almost the entirety of the land is owned by the military, who've now, in a process that we're familiar from, if you've read chapters 25 and 26 of Marxist Capital, have now called themselves landowners rather than calling themselves military leaders. But they've achieved the displacement of the population through violence. And now those people have gone back to work on their own land, but as wage earners. And I think, just to come back to Pierre's question in closing, one of the dangers of, for instance, a current, I think it's $112 million like peanuts really EU project to promote agriculture in northern Bahr el Ghazal and western Bahr el Ghazal, is that precisely it's going to give inputs and funding to that change situation, in a sense further formalize, thanks to the intervention of the NGOs who want to support the state, a situation in which there's been the wholesale displacement of people from their land. And I think that process is sort of dialectically moving in and out of processes of violence. Violence is followed by law, followed by further violence, followed by law, leading to this marketization, this transformation of the class structure in South Sudan.
Thanks. It's always beautiful when a discussion comes to a close with Marx and the specific references to some of his work. So we've, in doing so, we've encroached a little bit on the Q&A session, and I can see that we already have a bunch of questions lined up that we can see whether we can address. For people participating in the audience, hit the Q&A button, and we'll try to see how much of the questions we can go through. So the first question, I think it ties nicely into the discussion we've just had, is about herder and farmer conflict. So to what extent is that like a meaningful lens? It's something that is a frame that is increasingly being deployed in relationship to climate change and herder-farmer conflicts. A lot of money available, especially from the US, to kind of sort these things out. So how relevant is that of a category or kind of a field of tension in your respective countries? Louisa?
Sure, I'll jump in first. It's relevant. It's definitely relevant. And it does seem to be, it's definitely relevant. This kind of conflict has been going on for a while. It's been changing in recent years, though, in part because there's one level on which that kind of those categories of farmer and herder are helpful, and then there are other ways that they really aren't helpful, because you find that the category of herder, for instance, is a really diverse category, and almost impossibly diverse. And then also that people who get described as herders might not actually be herders. So it starts to get a lot murkier. And here I'm thinking of especially the people who in Central African Republic get referred to as the Peul. The Fulani, Falata, referred to by different terms throughout the region. But this is this sort of omni-ethnic category in a way that refers to a lot of people who are indeed herders, but also people who are involved in selling different kinds of medicines and different kinds of special, powerful treatments to people in different ways, who might be running different shops in marketplaces, and who generally are a bit more who might be a bit more mobile in their way of life than people who are more fully connected to farming for their livelihoods. And so, sometimes you do see conflict between people who are farming and people who are herding, but it kind of melds into and gets confused with all sorts of other dynamics that are going on. And in CAR, that includes the fear that a lot of people have, especially a lot of farmers have, that there are these rapacious foreigners who are coming in and dispossessing them of all of their strength. And the herders can be one instantiation of that. But again, herder kind of blurs into all of these other kinds of categories around foreigners, and maybe especially Muslim foreigners from northern regions, Chad and Sudan, who a lot of Central Africans are concerned about. So yes, it's part of the story, but it's sort of an entry point where you then need to look a lot more in a lot more depth at what's going on beyond that.
Thanks, Casper. Is herder-farmer conflict, and are these is this something that happens in Congo? And do you have something to say about it?
This is a very difficult question to answer, because on the one hand, let's say, yes, it plays a role in terms of lifestyles. On the other hand, it's also perhaps one of the most explosive, say, conflict categorizations, especially with the Banyamulenge situation in South Kivu, whereby, yes, the Banyamulenge have traditionally, historically, been herders to a certain extent, but it's not the only let's say, livelihood strategy that they have, but they still have it. And by the way, they're not the only ones in the area. And other communities like the Bembe, the Bavira, and so on and so forth, which are, you know, traditionally or historically, we could say, more agricultural. However, what has been, you know, clear from the beginning is that, you know, in this strategy of positioning, especially let's say the nationalist movements like the Mai Mai and politicians have been very keen to frame Rwandaphone, but especially Tutsi populations, also in North Kivu, as you know, invaders and someone, you know, who are tourists traveling around the whole region and in need of huge areas of land, and thereby displacing the autochthonous population. So it's part of this, let's say, very sort of fundamental underlying construction of that dichotomy between the autochthonous self and the foreign other. At the same time, and this is where things become complicated, you know, during the 70s, you know, the former President Mobutu, you know, kicked out the foreign, let's say, the Western capital enterprises, and which left a lot of open land open on the market. And he, at that time, you know, as you know, Pierre, I'm sure, there was a particularly influential Banyarwanda businessman who was also part of, you know, Mobutu's inner circle, who succeeded in sort of bartering a lot of this land with with other Banyarwanda, especially Tutsi businessmen that bought it up in North Kivu. And so you see that there are some, let's say, economic conflicts at the same time as there are social constructions around it, but between self and the other, and friend and enemy. And so you have this sort of very complex picture, which is probably what makes this, let's say, framing of the foreigner, you know, as someone stealing our land and kicking us out of our land, all the more effective. So yeah, it's part of it, but it's something which, you know, one should be very careful of framing the conflict in terms of that, because it's not a clash of cultures between herders and agriculturalists. That much I will say. But similar, of course, in Ituri, where the category is also extremely instrumentalized, and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's what I would say at this point.
Great, Joshua. How are things in South Sudan regarding herder-farmer framings? And
I mean, I'd probably say very much the same things as Casper and Louisa, so I'll try to be really brief, which is it's just there are and have been historically tensions between pastoralists and agriculturalists because they occupy two different modes of production and they have different land requirements. Then like those tensions in the current conflict have become extreme in the case of Western Bahr Ghazal and the Equatorias. But in both cases, what you have in those moments are either in Western Bahr Ghazal, Dinka pastoralists who have come onto territory displacing equatorial farmers, but they've come with the backing of the government. And they've come with a new legal regime provided by the government of South Sudan. And they often come as soldiers and as pastoralists. It's another double identity at once. So I don't per se think there's anything sort of essentially problematic about the relationship of those two categories. What makes it problematic is that groups of pastoralists have effectively taken over large parts of the government and have then used the government to effectively advance the pastoralist agenda. And then we see that even more markedly in Western Bahr Ghazal around Wau, where the Fertit Balanda populations are basically being consistently kicked off their land by pastoralists. But again, I think the international community fails to see that when you talk to those pastoralists, they're not pastoralists from the Dinka communities who have like 5 cattle or 10 cattle or 100 cattle. They're representatives of politicians in Juba, and they're young men who are looking after 1,000 cattle or 10,000 cattle. And because of that logic of accumulation, that's actually produced a transformed pastoralism, which has then imbricated and created all these struggles with agricultural populations, because suddenly they need a whole bunch of new land because the logic of pastoralism itself has changed. And I think so rather than seeing it as a question of like the farmers against the pastoralists, one has to look at, okay, so what is the emergent logic of these two things and how are they changing historically? And in South Sudan, that's about cows becoming effectively banks for massive levels of accumulation by diplomats in Juba, government politicians in Juba. And in terms of agricultural land, I think it's become even more problematic because those very same politicians have also acquired much of the land and pushed people off the land. So there's now even more small-scale cultivators in even smaller areas of land, creating even more sort of possibilities of tension for those pastoralists.
Thanks, Joshua. And it's just to give that a spin, it's actually a kind of elephant in the room, and it's really weird that there's so little studies being done about the transformation of pastoralism and the concentration of herds in the hands of individuals in South Sudan, because it's such an important dynamic and historically such an important feature of livelihoods. Whereas in the Central African Republic, it's really on the forefront of research and mapping exercises done by the international community. So that's something that gives me pause. So what I suggest is that in the interest of time, we do a round of Q&As for each of the three of you, because we have questions lined up actually for each of you. So perhaps starting with some questions for you, Louisa. There's one by Valérie Arnaud, who would like to know how you see the upcoming elections and how they affect the kind of current dynamics of relations between the state and rebel groups. It's something which was the subject of a recent report as well by, I think, the Enough Project. And a second question, just to kind of stack them on top of each other for you, is from Jackie Cho, who's really happy to see you live because she's relied on your work so much. And she wants to know something that was discussed already a bit. So what do you think about the shift towards the UN's growing recognition of intercommunal violence as a kind of legitimate category of analysis and in their kind of mapping exercises? Is it a more accurate representation of reality, she asks, and what might be the implications on programming and the people of CAR?
Okay, so thank you for those questions. The first question about the upcoming elections. Yes, elections are scheduled for the end of December, the first round, 5 years since the last election when Faustin Archange Touadéra was elected. You know, one of the things that strikes me in thinking about these upcoming elections is actually how similar the situation that we find today is to the situation 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we were preparing for these elections and there was a lot of concern about how they would play out because effectively most of the country is controlled by armed groups. How would that play? Today, it's the same situation. You know, we've had this president in place for 5 years, but the country's territory is still mostly controlled by armed groups. The big difference is that that same president is now standing for re-election rather than standing for election. And if you look at what he's been doing in the last several years, I mean, arguably since he took power, but in a more intense way, more recently, he has been doing absolutely everything, putting a lot of energy into preparing his re-election. And this is part of what I was referring to when I was talking about how, following Bayard, but how democracy has become a kind of language and discourse that gets spoken for the benefit of particularly the international donors who bankroll the whole process. But the kind of substance of it is really missing. And when you look at the kind of theory of power that somebody like Touadéra has based on what he's actually doing, what you see is that there's been all sorts of steps being made, all sorts of steps being taken to try to ensure that he will win the elections, and even more that he'll win in the first round, so not have to go to any kind of a runoff or anything like that. And one of the ways that he's been doing that is by trying to get into different kinds of alliances with some of the armed groups that are present. And there are a variety of other mechanisms as well. So, and one sort of X factor in the midst of all of this is that the president who was ousted in 2013, Francois Bozize, is also back in the mix and is hoping to contest the presidential elections. We'll know very shortly whether he's going to be able to or not. It seems like maybe he will. I mean, he certainly does not fulfill the criteria that are supposed to be in place for candidates. So that could be a somewhat, but him standing or not could be a somewhat destabilizing factor. But overall, my hunch, my sense is that it'll be a somewhat similar situation to what we saw 5 years ago, where there's a lot of concern about violence, but ultimately this election is a process that is being engaged in for the sake of the donors, and that the sort of people with power and authority on the ground are going to keep doing what they've been doing and don't see the election as a sort of existential threat to that exactly. Then the second question on this sort of shift towards the UN recognizing intercommunal violence as a thing. I'll have to think about this question a little bit more because I haven't really thought through all of the implications of it. It's something that I've been encouraging some PhD candidates who I know, Sophia Dawkins, for instance, who's one of our PhD candidates in political science at Yale, have been encouraging them to look into it more in a more rigorous way. But one of the things that I find really interesting is how it becomes such a catch-all for a really wide range of things. And then sort of how the ways that people will talk about how little they know about intercommunal violence, or the ways that it gets written about. So it'll be things like kind of along the lines of some of what Casper was describing of, armed men attacked this village. But because we aren't able to put a name on them and say they were rebels from this group or something like that, they just sort of go in this residual category of it's intercommunal violence, we don't know what's going on. It sort of has a lot of consequences in terms of how that violence gets engaged with or not. And so I think, I guess I'm sorry this wasn't a more articulate response, but I guess I see this as a topic that requires more research. That's a really interesting thing to be looking into more, but I'm not certain all of the repercussions of it yet.
Thanks so much for that, Louisa. So in the interest of time, we have to keep it a bit sharp, but it's very difficult because some of the questions we have are complicated questions. For instance, the question for you, Casper, which is from Marthe Belde, who is a starting PhD student working on the establishment of the Islamic State in the Sahel region. And she would like to know, is it important too, but also, what has been the benefits for you of moving beyond the traditional ways of thinking about political order, and how has the kind of adopting of the kind of governmentality perspective to understand rebels' relations to the local population? What kind of benefits has it given to you? You're muted, Casper, so we can't hear your fascinating answer.
Yes, this is a very academic discussion. It's one which I'd like to take, but it would take some time to explain this. But I can do a very short. I mean, it would be very much repeating what I said in the beginning, but I can do a quick one. Well, basically, it's to train yourself to not take established categories of thought for granted, and to work, let's say, historically at the same time as ethnographically, that's methodologically speaking, insofar as you have to understand both the, let's say, the influence of ideas of governance coming from the West, at the same time as you have to bracket them, meaning, so there are certain ways of thinking and governing which are related to the colonial state. There are certain ways of governing and ruling that are related to the market and so on, the environment and so on and so forth, which are not, necessarily invented in the Sahel, but which come effective in the Sahel through interventions of this and that sort. But the most important thing is to see, what do people on the ground actually do with them? It's not to say, well, it's not interesting just to say, well, the West is just, imposing their ways of doing things, which in certain ways they are, but it's to analyze what actually goes on. So it's to move beyond the sort of programmer's view of governmentality and see what happens actually on the ground with all these, ways of governing and ruling that are from the outside, and not just say, well, the state, and to this, let's say, not to take units of analysis as discrete categories. It's what we've been talking about all the time. You cannot just assume that a rebel is a rebel. It's a complicated figure, which might be a very heterogeneous construction for the actor, him or herself, and be very useful for someone else, basically. So it's really to sort of think beyond categories, and it's sort of counterintuitive to many sort of scientific frameworks, which is about knowing things and defining things, but sometimes we just have to acknowledge that the world is so complicated that we cannot necessarily reach this definitive categories of these things and approximate, find out approximate analysis by looking at what people do and how things are connected, reality empirically. So I mean, it's a long discussion, and we'll have huge epistemological discussion, but let's not go into that. And time is running out, and Joshua should have something to say.
Thanks, Casper. That was very brave of you. So Joshua, we have a question from Utrecht, from Anouk, who would like to know. She says you talked about this wealth transfer from people on the ground to elites, and then later on you start introducing these four kind of different types of figures you can think through. So how does this wealth transfer figure in the discussion on the different roles of soldier, militia, rebel, and bandit? Is the wealth transfer part of these dynamics, or is it something that happens through different processes simultaneously?
Thanks, Anouk, for the question. I mean, I think those four types are both ideal types, and their modes of visibility often given two very similar practices of predation. So how does the wealth transfer happen? Fundamentally, it happens through armed groups displacing populations from their land and then taking over that land and all the resources on it. That displacement tends to be done during this war, initially by militia forces and then by the army. So those are the groups that constitutively carry out the process of wealth transfer. And that would be the simple answer to say how that thing is formed. And I think on the part of the government, the decision to render certain groups as bandits and therefore not political is part of the way of trying to delegitimize certain communitarian struggles and legitimize other communitarian struggles as official, legal, and juridical as that pertaining to the state.
Thank you, Joshua. So time is running out. I want to thank all the participants, the speakers here, for their engagement. This was a very tough and dense discussion, but I think that that raises very many interesting questions, actually, and definitely sheds light on the kind of multifaceted and complex world of rebellion in Central Africa. So thanks to you, Louisa, Joshua, Kun in absentia, and to Casper. And also thanks to you in the audience for joining us here virtually at DIIS for a seminar on rebels in the state in Central Africa. Just so you know, the video will be uploaded. You can share it on social media, follow us online, and look out for new events and publications from all of us. Thank you and have a great weekend.